The winter morning draped Raven Ridge in a quiet, white shroud. It's the kind that muffled the world and slowed even the harshest heartbeats. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, settling on wooden rooftops and dusting the bare branches like a whispered secret. The wind carried a brittle chill that cut through wool and leather alike. Yet still, the townsfolk gathered, drawn by a grim curiosity that weighed heavier than the frost. On the auction block, wrapped in a shawl threadbare and worn thin by harsh days and endless nights, stood Marlin Whistler. Her eyes, a storm of grief and quiet defiance, flickered with the reflection of the pale morning sun. Cradled against her chest, wrapped in a blanket patched by trembling hands, was Sparrow, her newborn son. Fragile as the first breath of spring amid a frozen world, the murmurs began low, tangled in frostbitten gossip. "She's trouble," someone whispered behind gloved hands. No man claimed her, not even before the baby came. Another voice, sharp with disdain, hissed, "A burden, that one. And the child won't fetch a dime." The crowd, a mix of hardened ranchers and weary townsfolk, shifted uneasily. Yet their eyes avoided meeting Marlin's. Shame, the cruelest winter companion, settled around her shoulders like the chill itself. But she did not weep. Instead, she stood still, her grip tightening on Sparrow's blanket as if it were the last tether to a world that had turned cold and unforgiving. Silas Granger, the auctioneer, stepped forward with a grin as greasy as the coins he coveted. His voice, loud and full of practiced cruelty, cut through the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen, Raven Ridge's mercy runs thin. What's left is a debt owed in blood and bone. This woman, with her child, represents a burden no honest man here should bear." His words, heavy with condemnation, fell like jagged stones into the silent snow. He gestured grandly, the glint of gold from his rings catching the light a mockery of warmth. The crowd shifted, the air thick with anticipation, as if the world itself held its breath. One by one, the bids rose-cold currency exchanged for a woman and her newborn. A transaction that felt more like a sentencing than a sale. Marilyn's heart fractured in silence, the pieces scattering like the brittle leaves caught in the winter wind. Her knuckles whitened as she clutched the blanket tighter. The baby's faint, steady breath, a fragile pulse against her chest. Somewhere between the murmur of voices and the pounding of her own heart, time slowed. Snowflakes melted on her lashes, freezing before they fell. Each one a frozen tear in a story no one wanted to hear. The crowd's gaze flickered toward the road as a figure appeared, breaking through the swirling snow like a specter from the past. Boone Carver moved with the measured certainty of a man who had known loss too deep for words. His wool fur coat bore the marks of countless winters, and his boots pressed into the snow, leaving prints heavy with purpose. In his hands, a weathered shotgun rested not, aimed, not threatening, but steady. His eyes, dark and ancient, scanned the scene, and with a voice low and unwavering, he declared, "That woman and that child ain't for sale." Silence fell as though the snow itself had ceased its descent. The crowd's whispers faltered, suspicion and awe mingling beneath their breaths. Silas's bravado flickered, but did not die, his mouth opening to protest before closing again like a wounded beast. Boone stepped forward, a wall of quiet strength shielding Marlin from the cold judgments that had once felt as endless as the winter sky. Marlin looked up, her breath catching in the icy air as she met Boone's steady gaze. There was no threat there, only a fierce, protective calm, the kind that spoke louder than promises. Without a word, Boone shed his coat, folding it carefully over Sparrow's small frame. The gesture, simple yet profound, shifted something within Marlena, fragile hope. A whisper of safety. The auction crowd, now diminished and uncertain, retreated into murmurs of disbelief and grudging respect. Marlin felt the weight on her shoulders ease, the first breath of warmth she had known in months. Boone did not speak, nor did he demand explanation. Instead, he offered a steady presence, a silent pledge that for once, she and her son might be more than just wares traded like cattle as they turned from the frozen square. The wind carried the distant echo of Silas's anger, but it was drowned beneath the soft rhythm of snow against wood and the slow, steady steps of a man who refused to let the winter claim another soul. The road ahead was uncertain and tangled with shadows, but in Boone's quiet company, Marlin allowed herself the fragile flicker of something new, something like hope, and so, under the pale winter sun, two souls scarred by loss and burden took the first step toward something neither dared to name aloud. A slow, gentle journey away from the judgment of a town wrapped in ice, toward a sanctuary carved from frost and whispered promises. The cold wind sighed through the skeletal trees, and with it, the story began to unfold. The mountain trail stretched before them, cloaked in snow and silence, the forest standing like silent sentinels beneath the weight of winter's breath. Boone Carver's boots crunched softly against the frozen earth, each step deliberate, measured an unspoken promise of protection. Marlin walked beside him, her body still fragile, but moving with a quiet resilience. Sparrow nestled safely beneath layers of borrowed warmth. The world behind them, the jeers, the cold judgments, faded like footprints swept away by a drifting snowstorm. Here, in the vastness of pine and frost, time seemed to slow, and the heavy burden on Marlin's chest lightened ever so slightly. The cabin emerged through the trees like a whispered secret. Rough-hewn logs darkened by age and firelight, smoke curling gently from the stone chimney. It was not grand, but it bore the unmistakable mark of a refuge, sturdy, silent, and waiting. Boone moved with familiarity, pulling open the door to reveal a modest interior bathed in the amber glow of a crackling hearth. The scent of pine and dried herbs mingled in the air, wrapping Marlin in a quiet comfort she hadn't known she craved. She glanced at Boone, noting the careful way he stoked the fire, his fingers rough but gentle, the warmth from the flames echoing something tender beneath his weathered exterior. He placed a bowl of broth before her with a nod, wordless but full of meaning. Marlin accepted it, her hands trembling slightly, the heat seeping into her cold fingers like a fragile hope. Sparrow stirred softly in her arms, his breaths a steady rhythm against the turmoil in her mind. Boone busied himself nearby, stacking wood, his movements deliberate yet unhurried, a man unafraid to dwell in the quiet spaces between words. The silence between them was not empty. It was a slow unfolding, a cautious dance of trust and unspoken understanding. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the window panes and carrying with it the distant echoes of Silas Granger's bitter threats. Boone's eyes darkened at the mention, a shadow passing over his face as he moved to close the shutters with a firm hand. Marlin watched him, sensing the weight he bore, a past etched with loss and regret that whispered beneath his stoic silence. She reached out tentatively, tracing the faded scar on his weathered cheek, a small gesture of connection that spoke louder than any words. Boone met her gaze then, and in that moment the guarded walls they both carried seemed to falter, if only slightly. As the days slipped by, the cabin became a sanctuary not only of wood and fire, but of quiet healing. Marlin's nights were no longer filled with the harsh echoes of judgment, but softened by the gentle presence of Boone and the fragile life of Sparrow nestled between them. She learned the rhythm of his world, the crackle of the fire, the scent of pine resin, the way his gaze softened when he watched her from across the room. Boone, in turn, found solace in her steady courage, a balm to wounds he had long thought permanent. Their connection grew not in hurried declarations, but in small acts of shared blanket. A silent look, the careful tending of Sparrow's needs that bound them in a web of unspoken care. But peace, as it often does in Raven Ridge, was fragile. News of Marlin's sanctuary spread like wildfire, carried by the bitter tongues of those who had once condemned her. Silas's fury burned hotter with each passing day, his pride wounded and his power threatened. One evening, as the snow thickened and the wind clawed at the trees, Boone sensed the storm before it arrived. The distant crunch of boots in the snow, the flicker of lantern light between the pines, it was a quiet threat, but one that carried the weight of violence beneath its whisper. Marlin's heart clenched with fear and guilt, the weight of her presence on Boone's life settling heavy upon her shoulders. She faltered under the unspoken burden, but Boone's steady hand on her arm was a tether, a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. He spoke not with words, but with quiet resolve, a promise etched in the furrow of his brow and the calm strength of his grasp. They prepared silently, each movement a shared understanding of what was to come. In the dim light of the cabin, Marlin's eyes caught sight of a faded locket resting on a rough wooden tableau relic of Boone's past. Inside, a photograph of a woman and child, faces blurred by time but etched in sorrow and love. Boone's voice, rarely soft, carried the weight of old grief as he spoke. "I weren't fast enough to save Em. Won't be caught flat-footed again." His words hung in the air, a silent vow to protect what remained, to shield the fragile light from the encroaching darkness. The night deepened as Silas and his men approached, shadows moving like ghosts through the storm. Their demands came sharp and cold, voices cutting through the howl of the wind. Boone stood before the cabin's door, unarmed yet unyielding, a sentinel shaped by loss and tempered by resolve. Marlin, trembling but unbroken, stepped forward, clutching Boone's shotgun, though she knew it was unloaded. Her voice, steady despite the tempest, rang clear. "I ain't a thing to be owned." The words, simple and fierce, shattered the silence like a hammer to glass. The men hesitated, the firelight flickering against their uncertain faces. Boone stepped beside Marlin, placing a steady hand on the barrel of the gun, a gesture, not of threat, but of unyielding solidarity. The snow swirled around them, the storm itself seeming to hold its breath. Silas, confronted by a courage he could not break, retreated into the night, his menace dissolved by something stronger than violence. As dawn broke, the storm settled, leaving the world washed clean and new. Within the cabin's warmth, Boone and Marlin sat side by side, the weight of their shared ordeal lingering but softened by a fragile peace. Sparrow slept quietly between them, a living symbol of hope born from hardship. The scars they carried, the past's bitter cold, felt a little less heavy here, softened by the gentle care that had grown between them like slow-burning embers. There was no rush to speak of love or promises. Instead, Boone began crafting a cradle from cedar wood, each careful stroke a testament to his quiet devotion. Marlin, in turn, knitted a scarf the color of dawn, her fingers weaving warmth and light into each stitch. Their gestures spoke volumes in the absence of words, a slow dance of healing that unfolded in the spaces between heartbeats. In the stillness that followed, it felt as though two wintered souls were thawing beneath the fragile glow of something tender and unspoken. Their journey was far from over, but in this moment, wrapped in firelight and snow's hush, they found a sanctuary not just of wood and warmth, but of trust and possibility. Sometimes salvation arrives as a quiet stranger, bearing no grand promises but a steady hand and an open heart. In the harshest winters, when the world seems frozen and unforgiving, dignity can be reclaimed through kindness, small acts that bloom like wildflowers beneath the snow. And though the cold may return, the memory of warmth endures, lighting the path through even the darkest trails. If this tale stirred something quiet and aching inside you, wander back for more Wild West memories, and don't forget to subscribe for the next trail-worn story.